You have a room full of unpredictable, energetic, and opinionated middle schoolers. Do you take full control and run a tight ship in a teacher-centered classroom, or do you step back and let students take the wheel? That's what we're talking about in this episode of your Classroom Coffee Break. I'm John Van Dusen, a longtime teacher, coach, and Army officer, and in this episode we're talking about teacher-centered versus student-centered teaching and what works best for middle schoolers. I really struggled when this question first came in because it talked about a classroom, a teacher-centered versus a student-centered classroom. And I was struggling with that part because I was trying to think of too big of an answer with the classroom as a whole. Like when you walk into my classroom, is it student-centered or is it teacher-centered? And the reason I was struggling is because it's both based on what we're doing. So I changed the question a little bit from teacher-centered versus student-centered classroom and changed it to teacher-centered or student-centered teaching. And the reason I did that is it really depends on the topic and the activity that you're doing. And if you go back one episode to the episode we did on substitute teaching, you could really see a difference between if we have to try to teach something new versus if we're reviewing something. One of those has to be teacher-centered. One of those can be student-centered. So let's break it down and get right into it. First, let's define the difference between teacher-centered and student-centered and talk about some of the pros and the cons. So first, teacher-centered approach. This is where the teacher is the primary authority delivering information directly. And this could be reading from a book. This could be writing notes on the board. This could be lecture. There's several different ways where a teacher can be the primary authority in the classroom. And if you think back to when you were in college, a lot of those huge lecture halls, that is strictly teacher-centered teaching. And the reason for that is there's so many students, it would be almost impossible to have it be student-centered. So some of the pros of teacher-centered teaching is it's efficient for covering content quickly, covering it in a way that you need it to be covered or need it to be explained. It ensures students receive clear, structured information. I know when we do teacher-centered teaching in my classroom, the notes are set, the chapters of the book are set, and I know that the students are getting exactly what I need them to get to move on to the next part. And it's really great for managing large classes or really complex subjects where conversation can go off the rails very quickly. So some of the cons is it can lead to passive learning or route learning. So boring. Right? It can be very boring unless the topic is engaging, unless the lecturer up at the front of the room is super energetic. It can be one of the most boring ways to deliver content. It's boring for the teacher as well. And it also limits student engagement and critical thinking opportunities. If they are sitting and getting, they're not really using those critical thinking skills and applying what you're actually teaching. And that leads to the student-centered approach. And this is where students take a more active role in their learning. And when you think of this, think of some kind of project, think discussions, think collaborating on something. And some of the pros is this really encourages independent and critical thinking, where students can take some of the information that maybe they received in a teacher-centered approach and actually apply it and synthesize it so that they can better understand or more deeply understand whatever the topic is that we're talking about. It's more engaging, it's more interactive, and it helps students develop problem-solving skills, because if it's something they have to figure out on their own, they need to figure out how to figure it out. And some cons of a student-centered lesson is going to be that it requires really strong classroom management skills, and that starts with your classroom expectations. That goes with teaching the students how to learn in a student-centered environment, which could be, we're going to practice how to do this all record round robin. We're going to practice how to do heads up, pair up, share. We're going to practice how to do quiz, trade. We're going to practice all of these things before I expect you to do it with the lesson content. Another con is it takes a lot more time to cover lesson material. I know currently in my history class, we're a little behind where we usually are because I have taken the student-centered approach when it came to the Declaration of Independence, and we spent a few more days on it than we usually do. So it takes more time, but at the same time, that pro is my students have a lot better understanding of it. And the last con we'll talk about is some students may really struggle with self direction. A lot of students want you to tell them exactly what to do, where to do it, when to do it, all of that. And when you ask them to be creative and figure it out, it kind of high wires their brain and they're not really sure what to do. So again, that leads back to teaching them how to learn and letting them use their own problem solving and critical thinking skills. So what works best for middle schoolers? And the answer is, it depends. I'm going to say when to use the teacher-centered approach is going to be if you have brand new or complex material where students need clear explanations before they can explore concepts on their own. And an example I'll give of this is when we did the Bill of Rights. We talked about the First Amendment. If you go to read the First Amendment, it's actually kind of difficult because of the language used in the 1790s. However, once you can break that down and make it less complex, then you can move into a student-centered approach where the students can kind of explore those 5 creator-given rights guaranteed by the First Amendment on their own. Another time you may want to use a teacher-centered approach is if you are having an issue with behavior management. A phrase I use with my 8th graders is I say, I will give you as much freedom as you can handle. If you can handle sitting by your friends, that's fine. But if you can't, we're going to move back into that teacher-centered approach. You're going to sit where I tell you. You're going to do exactly what I tell you so that we can maintain the safety and limit the chaos within the classroom. And I would make the argument that this behavior management approach is going to be more of a beginning of the year thing until the students prove to themselves and to you that they can handle more of a student-centered approach. And the last segment of when you would want to use a teacher-centered approach is test preparation or foundational skills. So with test preparation, you want to make sure that the students understand the material that you're going to test them on. I tell my students all the time, I'm not going to test you on something I didn't teach you. It's not something that I expect you to learn on your own. And then foundational skills, I think of this when it comes to math, just because if you don't build the foundation of how to do math, the higher level math, it's all going to crumble down. So test prep, foundational skills, behavior management, and when you have new and complex material are fantastic times to start with a teacher-centered approach. Now, when it comes to using a student-centered approach, once you have taught them the new or complex material and you want them to either practice with it or apply it, once students have the basics, let them take that knowledge and try it out. Take it for a spin. I'll go back to the First Amendment project. I had them look at what did the First Amendment mean in 1795? What about in 1850? How about today? How does the First Amendment protect your creator-given right to speak, assemble, practice religion, petition your government? It's just really interesting to see the students take the basic concept and then apply it across a wide range of scenarios. And the second reason you'd want to use a student-centered approach is building engagement. And I find that with middle schoolers, I try to do something a little bit different every 4 to 8 minutes, just because their attention spans are so short. So if we're sitting taking notes, after 4 or 5 minutes, I'm going to have them stand up, push in their chair, and go talk with somebody else about what we just learned. Or I'm going to have them talk with their shoulder partner about something we just did, so that they're not just bombarded with brand new information. We take it in smaller, digestible chunks. So we'll get a little bit of teacher-centered instruction, followed by a little bit of student-centered, teacher-centered, student-centered. And it doesn't always work out that way, but I have found that's a good way to help mix it up and get them to apply and practice and engage with the material and with their fellow students by using that student-centered approach. So I kind of alluded to it in the last segment, but how do we blend both approaches effectively? And the way that my classroom kind of runs is we start with direct instruction and then we transition into more of a student engagement, student-centered approach. And the reason we do that is we start with the new and the complex material, obviously on a normal day, right? If we're continuing from the day prior or something, it's totally different. But we start with that new and complex material. And then, as I mentioned before, we'll kind of rotate between teacher-centered, student-centered, teacher-centered, student-centered. And as we go throughout the lesson or throughout the topic, I try to make it more student-centered as we go, as they build those base concepts. So another way we can do it is use guided inquiry. And what I mean by that is instead of just asking, what do you think about the First Amendment? You might say something in a more structured way. So when it comes to the freedom of speech, think about how does that apply to people who are posting on social media, right? And give them more of a narrow focus on what to think about. And then once they have that narrow focus and they kind of understand what you're asking, then you can broaden it. Okay, so we talked about social media. What do you think about putting it in a YouTube video? What do you think about putting it in the newspaper? What do you think about standing, in the middle of a square saying the same thing? And get those students to really take that narrow focus and then broaden the aperture out and see how it applies to other scenarios. So another way to incorporate this is discussion and collaboration. And I've mentioned that's kind of how my classroom runs, in that we try to take the topic and then expand it out and then come back and then expand it out. So another way you can do this is think, pair, share. We do numbered heads together. We use a lot of Kagan materials and Kagan engagement structures. And if you are a Kagan school, you know what I'm talking about. It takes a little work in the front end, but the students really do get engaged with them, with their peers and with the material. So it's something to really look into. There's also something I use in the Army there called liberating structures, and it's just different ways of getting students engaged. So if that's something you can work into your lessons, it's going to be a lot better than if it's just teacher-centered or just student-centered. So try to mix them up and make a blend. So the fourth way that you can help with blending these together is scaffolding independence over time. So when you first start out in September, it's probably going to have to be a lot more teacher-centered, like we had mentioned, for maintaining that behavior. But then as the year goes on and the students physically and mentally grow and they understand your expectations, you should be able to slide more into a student-centered scenario so that students are more engaged and take a little bit more control of their learning. And the last thing I'll mention with incorporating this is using technology to really blend those two items. So a couple digital tools that I use are Google Classroom and Google Slides, something that the students can interact with on their own. But also Edpuzzle is a great tool in that. This last week, we learned about the Mexican-American War, and we did some teacher-centered instruction, and then we did some student small group collaboration. And then the Edpuzzle, they're expected to watch this video that stops them periodically and asks them questions on their own. So now it's strictly student-centered. Each student is doing their own thing. Now, when we come back on Monday, I'll be able to take that student-centered lesson where they each learn the same thing and then bring it back to the whole class. And if you have different ways that you leverage technology, please leave me a note down in the comments. I'm always looking for different ways to make my lessons better, make my classroom more engaging, and just be a better teacher. And my guess is you do too, because you're listening to this episode. So you've been listening to this episode for a few minutes now, wondering what's the best approach? What do I do? Do I stay mostly teacher-centered? Do I stay mostly student-centered? And the answer is, just like it was in the beginning, it depends. It depends on the lesson, depends on the complexity, depends on the social emotional regulation ability of your students on their age level. And it really comes down to the art of being a teacher and being able to read the room, being able to read your students, being able to provide them some autonomy while still making sure that they get the content that they need. So there is no one size fits all answer, but if you can balance structure with engagement, your middle schoolers are going to get the best of both worlds. So thanks for joining this episode of Classroom Coffee Break. If you found this helpful, I ask that you share and subscribe and do all the things that are good. Until next time, keep growing, keep learning, and keep making a difference.